Welcome to the External Medicine Podcast. My name is Daniel Belkin, and I'm here with my co-host and brother, Mitch Belkin.
We're both medical students interested in non-traditional ideas and innovation. This podcast is our attempt to explore topics currently on the outskirts of medicine, topics not widely accepted by the mainstream, but that we believe merit a closer look.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. We do not endorse any healthcare providers or treatments. Our views do not represent the views of any official organization or institution.
If you'd like to support us, follow us on Twitter at EXMedPod and sign up for our newsletter at externalmedicinepodcast.com/subscribe. All right. Today's interview is with Dr. Bryan Carmody. Dr. Carmody is a pediatric nephrologist at Eastern Virginia Medical School. He's made a name for himself as a critic of certain aspects of medical education and the residency application process. For years, he's argued that USMLE Step 1 should go pass-fail and that Step 2 CS should be eliminated. Both of these happened in the last year and a half, so thank you, Dr. Carmody. If you haven't heard of him, you should check out his blog, thesheriffofsodium.com, and his YouTube channel, Sheriff of Sodium.
This conversation was recorded on June 21st, 2021. In this interview, we speak with Dr. Carmody about the history of the USMLEs, the value of standardized test scores, and the arms race in the residency application process. We also touch on conflict of interest in medical education and the rising cost of medical schools, among other topics. So in this podcast, at some point, we mention Campbells Law, and we don't really give a definition of it. So just to give that definition up front, Campbell's Law comes from Donald Campbell, who was a psychologist and social scientist in the mid-20th century. In 1976, Campbell wrote the following: "Achievement tests may well be valuable indicators of general school achievement under conditions of normal teaching aimed at general competence. But when test scores become the goal of the teaching process, they both lose their value as indicators of educational status and distort the educational process in undesirable ways."
We enjoyed this conversation, and we hope you do too. And now we bring you Dr. Bryan Carmody.
All right, we are here with Dr. Bryan Carmody. Bryan, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
So before we get started, do you have any financial disclosures?
I don't think I have any disclosures relevant to anything that we're going to discuss.
All right, great. For listeners who aren't familiar with your work, can you give us a little bit of a sketch of your background and your interest in medical education?
Sure. So I'm a pediatric nephrologist, and I practice and I get to teach some of the medical students at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. And a couple of years ago, I began to comment on certain things in medical education and residency selection on Twitter and on a website of mine that I call the Sheriff of Sodium. And in a certain strange corner of the world, I've got a devoted group of followers who participate in those discussions. And so that's sort of me in a nutshell.
In a Medscape article about you, which came out earlier this month, you mention an incident involving the teaching of nephrology, which seemed to trigger your interest in medical education reform. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I ended up doing nephrology, and actually, when I went into residency, I kind of had an idea that I might do that as a fellowship. But it's when people ask me why, I sometimes have a hard time explaining that because I really was very turned off from nephrology in my first and second years of medical school. The way that, I went to a good medical school. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, they were teaching it the way that I think most people teach it, but it was very non-engaging. It certainly didn't inspire me to love the kidney at that point. It was sort of a parade of transporters through the tubule, and it always struck me that the way that we taught the kidney physiology was really not the right way of doing it. And I contrasted it in my medical school to the way that cardiology was taught. And for a period of time, I think almost everyone in my medical school class said, "Oh, I want to be a cardiologist." And when I thought about it, what had occurred to me was that, the way our cardiology was taught was, they introduced certain principles. And the idea of of preload and afterload and stroke volume, and when you learn those concepts, you could confront an unfamiliar clinical scenario, and with those concepts, you could kind of extrapolate and make a useful prediction. And when you did that, you felt empowered and you wanted to keep learning more about it. And the way that we taught the kidney stuff was exactly like the antithesis of that. And that had been kind of sitting in my head for a few years. And then I got the opportunity to come back and teach the kidney module to our second year medical students. And initially I was all fired up because I thought that I was going to try to teach it in this completely different way. Because, and here I'm going to sidestep into another story, because, when I was in medical school, another thing that was not especially well taught was microbiology. We jokingly called it the bug parade, and it was just a series of lectures where you'd get an organism, and the lecturer would go through the virulence factors and certain diseases that it caused, and it was a very cumbersome way of organizing knowledge, and so we relied on this old book called Clinical Microbiology, made ridiculously simple, which is, I guess, in some ways like a spiritual forefather of sketchy. There's all these ridiculous pictures that you would memorize to know the virulence factors. And, in residency, in pediatrics, you see a lot of infectious disease. And that similarly occurred to me as, that's really a horrible, horrible way of organizing knowledge, because seldom does a patient come in and say, oh, I am a patient with Corynebacterium diphtheriae infection. That's not the way it is. Somebody comes in with a sore throat, or they come in with swollen lymph nodes, or they come in with pneumonia. And really the way you would want to organize your knowledge is in that sort of bucket. What are the organisms that cause this? What antibiotics should I choose to direct at this clinical entity? So I started to get this idea in my head that I would organize the nephrology course the way that there's a particular textbook of pediatric infectious diseases called Moffitt's. And that's how it's organized, is it has these clinical syndromes, and then you go through the organisms and the antibiotic therapy and so on. And that's really, like I said, the way you want to organize your knowledge. So I thought to myself, man, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take certain concepts, of extracellular fluid volume, and once we build the concepts, then we're going to go through the clinical syndromes of hypertension or hyponatremia or hematuria, and we'll build in the physiology, but we're going to do it so that I instill these buckets of clinical knowledge that are the way that people are going to want to access that knowledge, when they're seeing patients. So I was all fired up about it. That lasted a couple of months, because as I looked at what the students were learning, I realized that if I taught the material in that way, I think it would be a better way long-term of doing it, but it would hurt the students. It would hurt them because that is not the optimal way of preparing for the USMLE Step 1 exam. And even from the time that I took the USMLE Step 1 exam, 15 years ago, to the time that I returned to the classroom, I realized just how large that exam loomed in the lives of medical students, even more than when I did it. And I felt very constrained by that. But I mean, the whole reason I was interested in teaching is because I wanted to help the students. So I'm not going to do something that runs at cross purposes to that. So even though I felt like I had this better way of teaching the stuff, I wanted to do it in the way that would be the best way for the students to learn it. And given that, if you don't score high enough on USMLE Step 1, everything else in your medical career is sort of moot. That's what I did, is I tried to teach the test. But that put me in a position where I was getting a little bit resentful of the USMLE Step 1 exam. And then, one thing led to another, and some of my later work.
So you mentioned the USMLE Step 1 exam, and I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about the initial purpose for those tests and sort of like historically how they got started.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess I'll try to give a very high level overview of this. So for much of our country's history, medical practice was very lightly regulated. I mean, after in the colonial days, we had physician licensure laws. And then after Andrew Jackson, almost all those laws were repealed. And it was sort of this sense of, the anti-elitist, the value in the common sense and so on. So, I mean, if you wanted to be a doctor, you you could say you were a doctor. There wasn't, you could go to a medical school, you could go to a correspondence medical school, you could go to a diploma mill medical school, you could, there wasn't anybody keeping you from doing that. In the 1900s, though, things changed. I mean, by that point, almost every state had passed some kind of law regulating medical practice. And of course, that coincides with the expansion of scientific knowledge. In Andrew Jackson's day, to be honest, I mean, there was some truth in that notion that, doctors didn't know anything special, that, somebody with common sense didn't know themselves. We didn't have this vast armamentarium of, drugs and therapies to offer patients. I mean, you sort of got better or you didn't, and you provided nutrition and tried to take care of people's wounds, and you did whatever you did. But doctors, to be frank, really didn't have that much to offer, and many of the therapies that they did offer, were not really efficacious. By the 1900s, most states had physician licensure laws, and as a part of that, you had to pass an exam. The trouble was that those exams, they were all different. I mean, every jurisdiction had its own exam, and it made it cumbersome for physicians to move from one place to another. I mean, if you were practicing in Maryland and you decided you wanted to take a job in Virginia, you could, but you needed to get licensed in Virginia, which meant you had to take a separate exam in Virginia. And it provided a barrier to physician movement that people started to realize was not really what you wanted in an efficient medical system. So the American Medical Association began work to try to come up with a licensing exam that would be of such a high quality that it would be accepted in every state. And so they formed the National Board of Medical Examiners, and the NBME began to produce an exam. The format has changed over time, but they began to produce an exam with the intent of having an exam that, that if you passed it, it would speak for your credentials in any state. And so modeling some of the licensure exams in Europe, they broke up their exam into the first part being basic science, and then the second part being clinical science, and then having a practical examination, sort of at the end. And that's sort of the format of the 3-step USMLE exams, these days. So to get back to your original question, after all that long-winded response, the intent of the USMLE exam, step 1, step 2, it is intended to inform these licensing authorities in making a binary decision about, is this person qualified to receive a physician license or are they not? It was not something that was intended ever to be the residency aptitude exam or whatever it's become to all of us.
So you're saying the original intent was a demonstration of competency rather than a tool for stratification.
Correct. And so 2 additional points on that. Number 1 is that the exam is, as a psychometric instrument, it is specifically designed to discriminate best at that cut point. It's specifically designed as a testing instrument to provide its greatest discrimination on that line of, are you competent or not? It's not intended to, to distinguish, this person's got a 260, this person's got a 240, this guy can do, orthopedics, but surely not this one. It's not, that's completely an overextension from the test's purpose. And the second point to make is that given that the test was intended to make this binary determination, it's interesting you may wonder, why do we even have a score? I mean, why were results not reported as just pass, fail from the get-go? And the answer is there was actually quite a bit of discussion about that at multiple points throughout the history of the USMLE and the NBME exams. And what they always came back to was that students deserved to get a score, that you deserved to know, for your own sake, where you scored high, where you scored low, how far above the passing mark you were. But it was the perception was not that, residency programs need this, or, schools need this, or, the perception was that the examinees themselves need this.
In terms of the transition to the step 1 exam being used to stratify students who are competitive for certain programs versus not, when did that come into existence?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So, here, let me give you a little bit of extra history. So the National Board of Medical Examiners, began to produce their exams, and by the 1960s, that exam had pretty much supplanted the proprietary exams that each state was making. So after the 1960s, there weren't really physicians who were taking, the Indiana state exam, for example, to get licensed. You either took the NBME's exam or you took a different exam called the FLEX, the Federation Licensing Exam, which was a two-part exam that was necessary in part because the NBME, to take their exams, you had to be a USMD medical student. So as the United States began to draw more upon physicians who had done their training in other parts of the world, they maintained that sort of siloing for their exam, that it was only for USMD students. And so other people had to take this other exam. And some states actually didn't accept the NBME certificate. So for a period of time, from the 1960s up into the 1980s, we had this two-test system. You could take the FLEX or you could take the NBME exams. Either one was accepted in most jurisdictions, but there was a perception that was not a fair system. In particular, that it was not a fair system to U.S. citizens who elected to go to medical school abroad. Because if you were born in New York and you went to, SUNY, whatever, for your medical school, you took the NBME exams. If you decided to go to, do your medical training in the Caribbean, then you had to go through the FLEX pathway. And beginning in the 1980s, there was an additional basic science requirement that was added as a prerequisite to taking the FLEX. That was an extremely difficult test to pass. The initial pass rates for that exam were in like the 20 or 30% range, and it was intended. I mean, you can look at some of the messaging and public documents around that time. It was intended explicitly as a way of reducing the number of international medical graduates who were entering practice in the United States. There was a perception then that we were headed for this physician surplus, and that if we didn't do something, we were going to have this glut of doctors. At that point, there was no cap on Medicare funding for residency positions. So a hospital, if they wanted to have more residents, they just made the positions. Medicare funded them. There was really no reason that you wouldn't continue to add residency positions and so on. So anyway, applicants who were United States citizens who were exposed to this additional hard test, they said that's not fair. And they began to get an audience with state legislators in states like New York and California, where there's a lot of bustling hospitals that really depend on a stream of resident physicians who are not USMDs to fill their residency training positions and take care of their patients. And so the New York legislature was positioned to disallow the NBME exam if they didn't allow other people to take the exam. And that sort of is what led to broader discussions about, well, hey, maybe we should just have one exam system. And so by the late 1980s, the pieces were already moving to get rid of this two-test system and have just a single exam, for everybody. And that exam would be the U.S. Medical Licensing Exam, USMLE. And so if you think what that meant for residency selection, especially when that change was juxtaposed to another important change, which is that in the early 1990s, and remember, this is sort of the era of managed care, when again, people were fearful that, we didn't need that many doctors. We were training too many doctors. And so efforts were made to sort of slow down the pipeline. And so beginning in the early 1990s, we began to have more residency applicants than we had residency positions. Before that, there were actually, believe it or not, there were more residency positions than there were applicants. But starting in the 1990s, now you can imagine you're a residency program director. You're beginning to get all these applications from all these applicants because they're applying all over the place. They're starting to apply more broadly because not everybody's going to get a residency position. And so you start to get a fatter and fatter pile of applications on your desk every fall. And whoa, at the same time, look, we now have every single applicant who's taken this one single test. If you go back to the 1980s, people looked at the NBME exam scores, but you couldn't use it as an across the board universal screening metric because some of your applicants wouldn't have taken it, So you could take it for what it was worth, but you couldn't, say my cut score is such and such if you're not above this, because you're going to leave people out that might have been fine candidates who didn't take the test because they took the other test, So at the very same time in our history that we began to sort of have this need for a broad screening metric, lo and behold, it was provided, somewhat inadvertently by the USMLE, because now everybody took a single test. And that, by the way, is sort of the reason why the USMLE Step 1 exam became the king of residency selection, and not the USMLE Step 2 exam, which of course tests more clinically relevant material. The USMLE Step 1 exam, for any listeners who are not familiar, is a test of basic scientific knowledge. Much of it is really sort of a stretch to get to something that benefits real patient care. But that is the test that we use as a screening metric for the simple reason that that was the test that everybody had taken. Not everyone had taken Step 2 and had their scores available by the time that they were applying for residency in September of their fourth year. If you took the test over the summer after your third year, you might have scores back. When you applied, you might not, And so it meant, again, if you could look at a Step 2 score, you could have that influence your decisions about who to interview or who not to, but you couldn't use it as a universal screening mechanism because not everybody had it. Step 1 was the only thing that you could apply to every application in that pile. And so as its utility grew, so did its importance for medical students.
What is the data around the utility of Step 2 or Step 1 for predicting doctor performance, in residency or years later?
That's a tough question in a way because there's not any consensus. We sort of have what's called a criterion problem, where different people will tell you that different things matter in physician practice. We don't have some gold standard measure to say this person's a good doctor and this person's a bad doctor. So it makes it a little bit difficult to take any predictor if you don't have that gold standard, to say, So people have looked at certain things. There's a modest association between those exams. And when I say modest, I'm talking about very modest, and predicting, for instance, future physician discipline, like getting in trouble with the board. The most common endpoint that gets used is passing a subsequent similar exam. So much of the purported validity evidence for these exams comes from things like, well, we have people who took the USMLE exam, and look, when we gave them the American Board of Internal Medicine exam, the same people who did well on this multiple choice question test exam did well on this multiple choice question exam. And so, the knowledge that's tested on those questions, I don't mean to demean that. Patients want doctors who are knowledgeable. But I think it's also clear that practicing medicine is not the same thing as taking a multiple choice question exam. There are multiple attributes that I think most people would have consensus about, what makes a good physician, that are completely untested by any of those, metrics.
I was looking at this a little bit, and it's amazing how little data there is on it. Some of the more recent studies in radiology show Step 1 as being somewhat a little, again, it's a very modest amount, but somewhat predictive of lower rates of discrepancy on like prelim reads versus.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that paper. And in a way, that sort of, radiology in a way is sort of maybe a little bit of a different case insofar as suppose I manufactured a physician that only had medical knowledge. They had no bedside manner whatsoever. I just make a robot that has pure medical knowledge. You could get farther in radiology than you could in psychiatry. If you had no procedural skills, you'd be better off as a radiologist than an anesthesiologist. You'd be better off as a radiologist than a pediatrician. So I think that's those data are those data, but I'm not sure that they justify all the the harms and burdens of that using those exams the way that we do then imposes on the system.
To be fair to the radiologists, there are some proceduralist radiologists.
True. Yeah.
I wanted to float back to the idea of it's difficult to test for what makes a good doctor because there are so many different things that make a good doctor. And I think you brought out that what makes somebody a good pediatrician is not necessarily the same thing that makes somebody a good orthopedic surgeon. So it is somewhat
Correct.
strange that the metrics being used for orthopedic programs and pediatric programs are reliant on the USMLE exams,
Correct.
or I should say, one specific metric.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. It goes to show, and I think that you'll find this almost any place that that this logic is discussed. All of the evidence that supports using step one, it's almost all sort of after the fact justifications. You know, it's that, and it's easy to understand how that can become sort of. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but I mean, if you succeeded in your career, the path that you took to success, you take pride in it. Well, I worked hard on step one, I succeeded, therefore my path was a good one. My path was the right one, you know, and therefore, you know, the step one exam, I worked so hard on that. Therefore, it's a measure of hard work, and it's easy to see things that way, you know. I mean, everybody has their N of one experience, and it's easy to overextend what that can really tell you about the system.
So step one is now pass fail. Do you think that all of the value that has been placed on step one up until now will just end up being transferred to step two in the future?
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think that is going to happen, which is really disappointing to me because I felt like we really had a big opportunity, um, you know, with the announcement that step one would be moving to pass fail, to think about in a broader sense, like, how are we doing medical education? How should we do medical education? You know, and that's, of course, the part of this that's most important to me. But then, you know, associated with that, of course, because students' priority is making it to that next step. It's getting into residency and getting into residency at a place, you know, they feel is right for them. And so residency selection becomes a necessary part of that. And we really had an opportunity, and we still do. I mean, I don't mean to downplay that, but unfortunately, as you may remember, the timing of this announcement, it came in you know, February of 2020. And, you know, within 30 days after that, you know, the United States was swept up in COVID-19, and you know, everyone in medical education's attention got refocused onto just, you know, how do we move everything online? How do we take care of people in their clerkships? How do we do this? How do we do that? And so, unfortunately, I mean, I think that's made it certain that the default pathway for programs that you know, that use these score filters, they're going to move to a step two score filter. And the advantage of that is that you know, at least USMLE Step 2 tests knowledge that it could be brought to bear on the care of a human patient. So from that sense, I mean, it's an upgrade. But in one sense, it's a serious downgrade. And that is that, you know, when you're studying for the step one exam, I mean, you take off, I mean, many students take months off. You know, some international graduates take years to study for that test, you know, where you have no responsibilities, you have no obligations. All you're doing is grinding through flashcards, memorizing first aid, you know, living in UWorld. And now, unfortunately, you know, if you try to apply that to step two, and I do expect that students will begin to demand and will receive protected time to study for the step two exam, you know, apart from their clerkships. But unfortunately, if we shift that gravitational pull to the clerkships, now I think, you know, students are going to have to face this decision of, you know, do I hang around with the team and try to be useful and try to engage in experiential learning, and, you know, or do I sort of do as little of that as I can get away with and disengage as quickly as I can so that I can go to UWorld and excel in the shelf exam and excel in step two, because again, I know what's people are looking at, and they're not looking at, you know, the dean's letter as closely as they are, you know, my step two score. You know, if my step two score is not above a certain threshold at certain programs, your application just sits in a corner of air as hell. It never gets looked at.
What do you think of the idea? What if instead of getting a score for step two, people were just put into like quintiles or something like that? And I don't know if that would actually change any level of attention to it, but
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I mean, that was something that was discussed actually at the conference that ultimately recommended moving to pass-fail scoring. They considered alternative scoring systems. And that was one of them. Was, well, maybe you can put people in some graded category. I don't think that would do much to change step one mania, because you're always going to live in the uncertainty. I mean, you might know, well, my step one score is probably above average or probably below average, but I mean, God, I don't want to be in that bottom quintile because, then I'll never get what I want. Or, I don't know, some of my practice tests put me here, some there. You wouldn't be able to divorce yourself from this, fervor over exam prep. And to be clear, that is one of the main reasons that this test is harmful. I mean, there's multiple ones, but that's the main one, is that if you put all of our eggs in this USMLE basket, students are smart. Students have gotten into medical school by knowing very acutely what they need to do to get to the next level, to excel, to build their resume, to play that game. And they're being perfectly rational by putting all their eggs into that step one basket. But what that means is, and I'm sure that you guys have experienced this. I mean, I certainly see it from our medical students, and sometimes it's upsetting to see students that would benefit from learning other things or engaging in certain activities, and they don't have the time for it. And I can't be mad at them. It's the system that we've allowed to persist. I mean, they're just playing the game within the rules that we've set. Just to give you a quick example, one of the first years that I did our kidney module course, our kidney module is part of the heart, lung, and kidney unit. And, it occurred to me that one area of practical knowledge that was lacking among many third-year students that I saw in the wards was a knowledge of sort of intravascular catheters, what the lines are, why you might choose a PIC instead of a tunneled CVL, or why you might choose IJ access instead of femoral. And, being in nephrology, you do dialysis, and it's sort of, I had experiences where good medical students thought we were going to do dialysis through a peripheral IV, and so I felt like that was a thing where we could have a quick lecture, look at, what the catheters are, go through the indications. I thought that'd be useful. I still think it was useful. You can imagine what the feedback was. The feedback was, do not tell me anything that is not explicitly going to be on the USMLE Step 1 exam. I do not have time for it. I do not have space in my brain. Let me get back to, pressing the space bar and doing my UWorld questions. And I get it, I get it. That's, you can learn the stuff that I was trying to teach. You can learn that later. But, if you forget your, G protein subunits or viral strand sense, there ain't no do-over,
I think what you're pointing to is this, like, with respect to the USMLE, this sort of arms race. And I think it's maybe unfair to only talk about step one. Looking over some of the things that you've written and listening to some of your YouTube videos, it's true that the average step one exam has creeped up year after year, but also the number of publications that applicants needed have creeped up. And I assume that on lots of other metrics, the number of things that people need to just remain average has increased. And so with this arms race, you have a total disconnect between the rational incentives of medical students and what they should be learning in order to advance their careers and what ultimately will make them good clinicians and good doctors. So I guess my question to you is, what are some ways that you think about changing that incentive structure?
Yeah, right. So just to sort of flesh out something that you made a point about, which is exactly correct. In an ideal system, the goals of the educational system, would provide the incentives that we want for students, that we would align the goals of residency selection and the goals of medical education, so that, if you have those two things aligned, then you create a virtuous competition where, you're working harder to learn things that are useful, that will actually benefit your patients and make you a more capable physician. That's good. On the other hand, if all you're doing is, grabbing these empty brass rings and stashing arrows in your quiver just to have a bigger and bigger pile of, abstracts that no one's ever going to read, or, how can I spin this project into multiple papers so that I have more lines on my CV? And to be honest, that's not something at all that's limited to medical students. I mean, the ground zero for that is faculty, publishing trash research and, taking everything to the least publishable unit, because of course that's what's valued by promotion and tenure committees. So if you want to get promoted as an academic person, there's that whole arms race there. And
So maybe we are teaching medical students what they're going to be doing later on.
yeah, in that sense, unfortunately, you are. And of course, you can imagine, though. I mean, that's not exactly. I mean, that system actually. I mean, to jump over to that, this idea of, we want faculty members who are academically engaged, who are contributing to the body of knowledge. That's a valid premise. But when you measure that by like your number of publications, it's a guarantee that you're going to get the flimsy research. You're going to get some amount of fraudulent research because you're incentivizing it, And I think that one thing that's uncomfortable, but that you have to acknowledge, is that there's no numeric metric that will not fail you. You have to use some element of human judgment, and that makes people uncomfortable. And I think it makes us uncomfortable for a good reason, because if you rely on human judgment, you're prone to all the human biases that you have. But I'm just going to tell you, you cannot reduce, what's a good faculty member boil it down to a single number. You cannot do that with residency selection. You can't do it with anything else either. It will always lead to a system where chasing that number leads to harmful externalities.
There's a great essay by Paul Graham that I read recently called The Lesson to Unlearn. And I just want to read 2 paragraphs from it really quickly. So, suppose you're taking a class on medieval history and the final exam is coming up. The final exam is supposed to be a test of your knowledge of medieval history, right? So if you have a couple of days between now and the exam, surely the best way to spend the time, if you want to do well on the exam, is to read the best books you can find about medieval history. Then you'll know a lot about it and do well on the exam. No, 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 experienced students are saying to themselves. If you merely read good books on medieval history, most of the stuff you learned wouldn't be on the test. It's not good books you want to read, but the lecture notes and assigned readings in the class. And even most of that you can ignore, because you only have to worry about the sort of thing that could turn up as a test question. You're looking for sharply defined chunks of information. If one of the assigned readings has an interesting digression on some subtle point, you can safely ignore that, because it's not the sort of thing that could be turned into a test question. But if the professor tells you that there were 3 underlying causes of the schism of 1378, or 3 main consequences of the Black Death, you'd better know them. And whether they were in fact the causes or consequences is beside the point. For the purposes of this class, they are. I just feel like that summarizes a lot of what I've done as a test taker. You sort of get a sense of what you're learning in taking many of these exams is, what is this exam question really asking? And that's what you're learning how to answer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what you just described was exactly the universe of step 1 prep. I mean, I think a lot of students, I've heard from many students who have a lot of internal angst about whether they're using the best study resources. Am I using the best Anki deck? Am I using, the best study good? What's the best QBank? Because, you want something that reduces the knowledge down to the smallest testable piece, and you want to just stash all those little testable pieces into your brain, for easy retrieval on the test. And that's a very efficient, purpose-driven system, to use these flashcards to excel in the step 1 exam. And the proof is in the pudding. Like you sort of alluded to earlier, students each year score a little higher and a little higher and a little higher on the step 1 exam. Although probably there's not that many people that would say, oh yeah, we now have this, race of superhuman, medical students who, is smarter than any generation of doctors in previous history. I think few people think that. It's just that we've squeezed our students higher. They have more efficient, study resources. They have this pressure upon them to score well on the test, and that's exactly what they go and do.
So, if you were made dean of medical education of all of medical education in the U.S., what sorts of changes would you like to see made?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. So, you can sort of think about the root causes of a lot of problems that we have, but I personally think, I would try to convince residency program directors that they need to be a part of the solution. This is one of my big soapboxes. You may have heard me preach about it before, but I think often residency program directors feel like they're victims in all this. You can talk to them and they legitimately feel, every time I open ARSC, I'm deluged with these applications. What do you want me to do? I get all these applications, and every time I look through them, everybody's letters of recommendations look the same. Everybody's walking on water and, doing these amazing things. What do you want me to do? Every time I look at people's dean's letters, they all look the same. I'm wading through this, 5-page word soup. What do you want me to do? I'm going to use a step 1 score. And if you listen to that, it's easy to find that sort of logic convincing. But then you got to step back and you got to ask, who has the power in this situation? It's the program directors. Everything that you're doing as a student, as a future applicant, is to gain the attention of the program directors. If the program directors in a competitive field or at a competitive institution, said, here's what we want you to do. You watch at how quickly people will start to provide whatever it is they say they want. And so one thing that I think residency program directors need to do is that they need to articulate and select based on the things that they say are important. So for instance, just to give you sake of example, you guys will be reviewing your dean's letters soon, your MSPE that goes out with your applications. The AMC provides recommendations for how that MSPE should look. There's certain categories, and the font is not supposed to be smaller than a certain number. And then there's a recommendation, for instance, that the MSPE provides a summary statement. That some schools, for instance, might use a summary statement like my school that groups students into overall quartiles of academic performance. Others use something that's a little more fluid, like they may have 10% of students that are exemplary and 25% of students that are outstanding, and whatever. But many schools actually don't provide any statement of the kind. They say, we trust that our narrative evaluations will provide more than enough information for you. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the MSPE is the best, most useful metric. But just imagine for a second what it would be like if program directors in orthopedics or neurosurgery or OBGYN or any number of competitive fields said, you know what, if you don't put a summary statement on your MSPE, your application is going to the back of the pile. We're sick of the fact that 25% of schools do not provide this, despite decades of guidance from the AMC saying that we should. So, do it or don't, we don't control you, but your application is going to the back of the pile. And if we can't find enough people to interview, then yeah, we'll come back and look at it, but you're going to the back. How long would it take for students to be in front of the dean's office with torches and pitchforks saying, you better put a summary statement on that dean's letter or you are going to tank my application? And overnight, it would transform. Okay. So, and if you don't think that's true, I'm not sure that's how it would work. The program directors have the leverage if they choose to use it and choose to stop saying, well, we have to outsource our power and decision-making responsibility to the USMLE because what else is there? They have the power to leverage the changes that they want. And what would be ideal, I think, is if each specialty said, let's think about the things that we actually want students to know, the skills that we actually want students to have when they arrive in my residency program on July 1st in my discipline. I really want people who can do this and that and the other thing. And so I'm going to reward schools that teach those things, that measure those things in a legitimate or validated way. I'm going to benefit their students, by taking them into my program, and watch how quickly the market will correct to provide those things. So I think it's even more important when you think about the era that we're currently in, where duty hours are still enormous, but they're limited. Versus 20 years ago, and they're not going to get any longer. Any old timer who pines for the days of unlimited resident work hours, that's a one-way valve. We ain't going back. There's no way we're going back to the Q2 call days, period. So if you want to provide the same training, your training needs to be more efficient. if you say, oh, well, a general surgery resident needs to do this and that and the other thing, and so we can't do it, and if you restrict our hours, well, you got to make you're going to have to either make your training longer, which I think is unappealing, or you need to make it more efficient. And unfortunately, at the same time that we have these duty hour restrictions, we have had a dilution of the quality of care that residents provide, where in many cases, residents have much more screen time and order entry and, data retrieval through the EMR than they ever did before. Their jobs are more challenging in that way. And that's a bad recipe. There is a certain amount of true experience that you have to gain as a resident. And I'm not saying you don't gain that, you do, but there's certainly a lot of screen time. And so honestly, some of that educational burden, in my opinion, needs to be shifted back on the medical school. It's silly, I think, in the year 2021 to cling to this idea that that after 4 years of medical school, everyone is the same, that we're all undifferentiated, that we all have the same core things. Yeah, there's some amount of core knowledge, but I think as medical practice gets more and more specialized, it's unrealistic and ultimately does not lead to more qualified physicians to teach people a bunch of stuff that they will not use and they know they're not going to use in their future practice. Some of the things, if you want to be a diagnostic radiologist, then the medical school probably could do a better job of preparing you to enter a diagnostic radiology residency program instead of pretending that, oh, you're exactly the same as a student who's doing family medicine. We're going to give you the exact same things. I'm not saying we have to get rid of the core clerkships or something like that, but I think that schools need to take on the burden, and I think of some of that education, and I think that residency program directors should guide them into doing that.
Interesting. What do you think about the idea of the first 2 years of medical school being done, or some portion of the first 2 years of medical school being done outside of a medical school where you're paying, $50,000, $60,000 a year? I mean, you can learn so much from Boards and Beyond or Sketchy or Pathoma, and oftentimes those lectures were better than the lectures that I was getting in school. Obviously, that's not going to supplant the catheter lecture, and there are certain things that certain exposures to clinical medicine you probably should get during the first 2 years, but I think I learned more from those cheap $100, $200 a year resources than I did from my medical school.
Right. I think that it's a completely logical idea that because of economic protectionism will not occur. But you articulated much of it, which is 100 years ago, people went to class in medical school because that was the most efficient way to learn. The most efficient way to acquire medical knowledge was to go and listen to that knowledge fall out of the mouths of people at the lectern, and writing on a chalkboard. That was the best way of doing it. I mean, you could go to the library and pore over some dusty tome of a book, but think about, 100 years ago, books, they didn't change that often. Your school, your library was limited by the physical books that it could acquire. Lecture was an efficient way. You heard from the experts. And of course, as time has gone by, it's become a much less efficient way of conveying knowledge. As you said, it's silly. It is beyond silly and actually verges into, questions of financial conflict of interest for every school to recreate the same resources that are done better by companies that are in this space. And that's just telling it like it is. And in my opinion, medical schools need to provide value that is commensurate with the tuition that they charge, or they need to stop charging so damn much of it. That's the reality. Now, of course, the way the system works, though, schools have a trump card. They can provide, and let me be clear. Anybody who's listening, I don't mean that, there's all these medical schools that are, just greedy. And, I think they have good intentions. Almost every person, almost every school has good intentions, but you can't just ask your faculty to, try to out first aid at every school in the country and think that you're adding value. In reality, faculty have value to add to that material. And that's what we should be doing. But as you know, at some schools, that's not the case. At some schools, students are completely divorced. The faculty add little value to, as you said, lectures that are done better in Pathoma, or boards and beyond. And unfortunately, though, the schools still can command whatever tuition they choose to charge, because you can't sit for your board exam unless you're a bona fide student at the university. I mean, you can't just choose to take the USMLE Step 1 exam because you think it's a cool thing to do. You've got to have the school vouch for your credentials. And so it's unfortunately a self-supporting system that doesn't necessarily have an incentive to improve in the way that, to me, it seems logical that it should.
I think that most medical students are, I shouldn't say most medical students are, I assume most medical students are aware of the year after year price increases. So for instance, I looked at my school, University of Maryland, and between like 2012 and today, the price of tuition went from whatever it was then and doubled to now being just under $40,000 a year, purely tuition. And that vastly outpaces inflation. And I assume that there are lots of reasons for this. I don't think University of Maryland is special in that regards. All medical schools, all higher ed has gotten more expensive. One thing that I've seen you write about and tweet about that I don't think gets as much attention is the financial conflicts of interests related to some of the organizations that medical students only interact with directly. So I remember you posted an image of the amount of money that ERAS brings in every year to the AAMC. I think it was like something like $94 million in essentially just higher application numbers from medical students trying to out-compete each other to get into medical school slots. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about
Residency spots.
I'm sorry, thank you. Residency slots. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the less visible financial conflicts of interests that exist within the 3 and 4 letter organizations that we all get jumbled up.
Yeah, I have much that I could say about all of that. Let me kind of. I want to say one thing about what you said about medical tuition costs, because this is an important point that extends to some of the discussions that we might have about these nonprofit organizations as well. If you ask schools, if you say, "Hey, why is your tuition so high?" A common response is they'll say, well, our tuition is not that high. It's expensive to educate medical students. We're barely recovering our costs. And then whoever asked the question sort of is like, oh, well, okay. And they trot away with their tail between their legs or partially satisfied or whatever. But there's sort of a natural follow-up question that should be asked, which is, well, why are your costs so high? Why? I mean, that's natural, right? Because we were just discussing one obvious way that you could trim a lot of costs, which is don't try to, reinvent the wheel with stuff that's done better elsewhere. I mean, either make better stuff or let people buy better stuff and, trim things down. But of course, there's not any incentive to trim costs at almost any medical school, or even academic medical center. There's very little incentive to reduce costs. A similar logic applies to the USMLE exams. If you ask, well, how do you set this price? How does this exam cost, the Step 1 exam cost $600 some dollars? How? Well, that's just, we peg it to our costs. Well, why are your costs so high? Well, we pay our executives, $700,000. Oh, well, maybe that's an area where you could trim some costs. Maybe that's an area that doesn't contribute to the mission of the organization in a way that justifies it dollar for dollar, So I think that's an important point. And I think that we should all be more willing to ask that question. I mean, well, what is making the cost so high? And should we just accept that the costs are that level, or perhaps should we look closer at them and scrutinize them? Now, like I say, that's a point that plays into many of these nonprofit organizations that are involved in medical regulation. It is important, I think, if you're going to discuss conflict of interest, to have a good working definition for what that means. All these nonprofit organizations, they have a mission. They have a mission to do one thing or another. Just like a physician has a professional duty, to do certain things in your job. So conflict of interest is not a behavior, it is a condition. Sometimes people get squeamish talking about conflict of interest, like you're calling someone out, or you're insulting someone or questioning their moral fiber, and they get very offended. And the reality is that conflict of interest is a condition. It's not a behavior. It is the condition that exists when a financial incentive may run counter to what your professional incentive or mission or responsibility would have been otherwise. And so it is very easy to see the conditions in which those that may take place in medical education and regulation. You highlighted a very good one. The Association of American Medical Colleges is the sponsor of the Electronic Residency Application Service, or ERAS. When they set ERAS pricing, they could decide many different ways of how to configure that. They could say, all right, we're going to give you one set fee across the board. Everyone's going to set this, and then you just check the boxes of the programs that you want to apply to. Or they could say, every application costs the same amount. Or they could say, as they do now, you get this many applications for a low price, you get this many applications for a slightly higher price. And if you exceed that many of applications, then you pay even higher price for that. How you choose to make that decision, there's many things that go into it, but of course, one is how, what's going to keep your books looking good. And when an organization, when one of these nonprofit organizations makes a surplus, when they take in more money than their program costs, what makes them a nonprofit organization is that they cannot distribute that money to their shareholders like a for-profit entity might. If Coca-Cola took in a bunch of money and they look at their, operation, they're like, yeah, we're good. We're going to, distribute this to our shareholders as a dividend. That'd be fine. But the AMC can't do that. The NBME can't do that. The FSMB, the ECFMG, they can't do that. If they take in more money than they need, they have to invest that money in themselves so they can make new programs, or they could, invest it in themselves by raising salaries because they did such a bang up job to make that money in the first place. And, gosh, that's what everybody else whose organization has this much revenue is doing, so we got to keep our salaries competitive, or else we can't attract the quote unquote top talent to our organization, to run it. And so it's easy to see how there's the potential, at least, for a little bit of a bias to creep into the decisions that you make, because they are running businesses. But I don't think that it serves the AMC's tax-exempt mission to make money hand over fist on ERAS as they do, and I think similarly, almost any of these organizations, you can look at where their revenue comes from, and it's easy to see how in certain cases, in certain decisions where a value judgment has to be made, how that financial incentive could bump up against a true, unbiased, professional, mission-driven decision about what the organization should do.
You have a great video online where you argue for residency caps, or caps on the number of applications that medical students can submit to residencies. I would encourage any listener who's interested to listen to that full video. But if you wanted to just sort of summarize some of the points that you make of why that might be a good idea, could you?
Yeah, well, I think that over-application is a main driver of many things that make medical education and residency selection worse. We talk about how, much of our discussion earlier was about, the outsized role of USMLE exams. Well, why do program directors feel like they need USMLE exams to filter applications? It's because they get too many damn applications. When you're overrun with applications and you're a program director, you're not an admissions officer. That's a side note, but an important point to make, which is that, when you apply to medical school, over applying is not exactly a good thing. It still brings some harms to the system, but at least your application is being read by professional admissions officers. When they wake up, their job is to do admissions. When they are at work, they're doing admissions. A program director is a part-time job, and only a part of it is applicant selection. I mean, your primary focus is actually the residents that are in the program. So it really is an enormous burden when you drench programs in all these applications. So what do they use? They use whatever the lowest filterable metric is. Maybe it's USMLE scores. Maybe it's geographic location. Maybe it's MD versus DO. Maybe it's a certain number of feeder schools. Maybe it's citizenship status. And none of those things are exactly probably something that we want or that we think is the right way to choose people for a scarce resource. But that becomes a natural defense mechanism if you allow programs to get 1 billion applications, So in my opinion, if you want, it sort of comes down to this. If you're an applicant and you want, or if you're an applicant and you believe the best system would be one where someone can look at you as a person, as a human being, at your strengths and weaknesses. They can look at your test scores. They can read your research. They can read your letters of recommendation. They can think about you. And maybe you win and maybe you lose. I mean, we live in a system where not everybody's going to be a winner. I mean, you can choose whatever application and selection system you want. Not everybody is going to get to be an orthopedic surgeon. Not everyone is going to get to go to Brigham and Women's for their internal medicine residency. There's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. But I think it is incumbent upon all of us to try to have a system that is fair and equitable and honors the values that we want to see in our future physicians. And so if you want that system, you cannot contribute to over-application as a system because it will necessarily lead to, an application of Campbell's Law, an all in on, I've got to have this many publications or I get screened out. I got to have this step score or I get screened out. So if you want to be considered as an individual, then application caps are the way to do that. You've got to limit the number of applications that programs receive.
What do you make of the idea of making because right now there's a problem between demand and supply. The number of spots is smaller than the demand for those spots. So if there's a doctor shortage, why don't we just increase the number of spots available by 50%? Or the number, we need extra doctors or clinicians. We could just double the number of doctors overnight. I mean, it'd be bad for salaries, but that might solve a lot of the competition issue.
So I guess at the beginning, let me say, I do think we need more residency positions. So I'll say that at the outset. But if you think through that kind of proposal, let's say that we said, all right, last year we had, I don't remember exactly how many, say 45,000 applicants for 38,000 residency positions, something ballpark in that neighborhood. So let's say that I see those numbers from the NRMP report and I say, all right, that's it. We're going to add 7,000 residency positions. Everybody gets a position. And then we'll move on. What do you think happens the next year? I mean, we have 45,000 positions, 45,000 applicants. No, we probably have 50,000 applicants because remember, the United States is privileged in we draw physicians not just from our own medical schools whose output is sort of fixed, but we draw physicians from all around the world. And there's a vast supply of physicians who train overseas, who are capable, who would happily train in the United States if they were given the responsibility. So I don't think you're going to be able to increase the number of positions to accommodate the number of people who would seek those positions. Or even if you did, you think about what other incentives you're creating. You're creating incentives for sort of diploma mills to pop up. Why shouldn't I just go to an island in the Caribbean, open the Sheriff of Sodium School of Medicine, do what I just said, say, all right, man, here, I'm going to give you a diploma in 4 years. You just have at it with, sketchy and pathoma. I'm going to stamp my diploma on you. And my medical school is going to have a class size of 1,000 people a year. Why couldn't I do that? I would actually be creating an incentive to do that. So I think a better system is, and this is still a system that's removed from the one that we have in place, a better system is we need to actually have a careful workforce analysis. We need to decide what are the physicians that we think we need And what are the proportions of specialties that we think we need? And what are the areas where we think we need those physicians? And we probably need to have some thoughtful residency creation in those areas to get that distribution. Because instead, what we have is a system that's market driven, but it's market driven not by the broader market, but by the incentives of a hospital to create a residency position. What I mean is, there's no residency czar sitting on high who says, I see that 10 years from now, we're going to be understaffed in the emergency department. And so therefore I decree that we will have 100 more residency positions in emergency medicine. Now go forth and make these positions. There's no one doing that. Instead, what you have is you have an individual hospital who looks at their books and they say, if we add more residents, I can estimate that our emergency department will be more busy. Our attendings will bill more. They'll see more people. We'll get this much more throughput into our OR and our hospital floors because patients won't go to our competitor hospital. And therefore, I'm going to add an emergency medicine residency position. And so what's good for the hospital determines whether that position gets added, because unless you have access to federal funding, which since the balanced budget amendment cap on GME funding, hospitals have to fund at least some of this themselves. So they look at it from their own self-interest. Do I need a residency position? Will that benefit my hospital in one way or another? And if it does, then you add it. And if it doesn't, then you don't. And that's how we decide if a residency position is going to get made or not. So that's not really the system that we want. That's not a system that's, it might give us the workforce that we want in the future, but there's certainly no guarantee. And there's certainly no broader thinking about whether all these individual systems are going to get us where we want to go or not. So in my opinion, we need to have a little bit more of a thoughtful approach to what the physician workforce should look like in the number of physicians and in the specialties that they should be in, and then create GME to serve that purpose instead of leaving all the hospitals individually to make that decision, as it is sort of currently.
If people want to learn more about you or to contact you, where can they find you?
So I'm on Twitter at JB Carmody, JBCARMODY. And most of the things that I comment on are on Twitter, at some point. The sheriffofsodium.com, that's my website where I post sort of long form content. I actually have a YouTube channel where I've posted some lectures that I've given for, sometimes actually just specifically designed for that channel. Sometimes they're lectures that I've sort of repurposed from something else, but to share my thoughts. So that's there also.
Well, thank you once again. We really appreciate you taking time to speak with us today.
It was a pleasure. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Take care. If you'd like to support us, here are some ways you can help. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, preferably a phenomenal review. Visit us at externalmedicinepodcast.com and tell your friends.